The letter hit the floor of Harriet Donnelly's cabin like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples it sent through her chest were enough to make her knees buckle. She had found it tucked beneath the edge of her porch step that morning, written in the cramped hand of Miss Sutler, the postmistress's wife, who had apparently decided that gossip was far too precious to keep contained within the walls of the general store. The words were brief, blunt, and devastating, in the way that only the truth delivered without kindness can be. You ought to know, Harriet, that Deputy Whitfield has been riding an extra hour out of his way every single day for the past 8 months just to pass your cabin on his morning patrol, every single day, and he never told you, not once. Harriet stood with the letter pressed flat against her sternum, her breathing shallow, her eyes fixed on the middle distance where the pine trees swayed against a steel-gray Colorado sky. 8 months. She counted backward in her mind, and the number landed somewhere around the end of April, which was right around the time that Chester Whitfield had first tipped his hat to her at the Mercantile and asked, with a studied casualness that she now understood in a completely different light, whether she was settling in well to life on the frontier. She had told him yes. She had been polite and brief and thoroughly disinterested, because she had told herself after everything that had happened in Missouri that she was done with men who wore badges and carried guns, and believed that the authority pinned to their chest gave them license to make decisions about other people's lives. But he had not stopped. He had just kept riding past her cabin day after day without ever saying a word about it. And that, somehow, was the thing that was cracking her open right now, standing alone in her kitchen with a stranger's letter against her heart. Not deception, not manipulation, not the aggressive pursuit she had learned to be afraid of. Just a man riding an extra hour in the cold and the dust and the rain, just to be briefly near a woman who had never given him any real reason to hope. The question that burned through her was not whether she was moved by this. She was moved. She was furious at herself for being moved. The question was what she was going to do about a secret that nobody had bothered to tell her until now, a secret that had apparently been common enough knowledge in Ridgeline, Colorado, that the postmistress's wife had felt comfortable writing it down in a letter, which meant that everyone in this small, tight-lipped, sharp-eyed frontier town had known except her. And Chester Whitfield had let them all know. He just had not let her. She set the letter on the kitchen table and looked at it for a long moment. Then she picked up her shawl, stepped out into the cold October air, and decided that she was going to get some answers. Ridgeline, Colorado in the autumn of 1882 was a town that existed in a permanent state of almost prosperous, with the silver mines 3 miles east pulling enough ore to keep the saloon busy and the general store stocked, but not enough to attract the railroad or the kind of lawyers who made a town feel permanent. Almost peaceful, with Sheriff Gideon Holt keeping a loose but effective order over the 1,000 or so souls who had staked their futures in the mountain valley. Almost beautiful, with the peaks turning white at the tips and the aspens gone to gold along the creek beds. Harriet had arrived in Ridgeline 14 months ago, in August of 1881, driving her own wagon and carrying nothing that she could not replace. She was 27 years old, the daughter of a schoolteacher father and a seamstress mother, both dead of the fever that had swept through the river towns of Missouri 3 years prior. She had spent the following year navigating the slow collapse of everything she had thought her life would be, including a broken engagement to a man named Gerald Pratt, who had turned out to be not only unfaithful, but quietly dangerous in the way that certain men become when they realize a woman is no longer willing to look the other way. Gerald had worn a deputy's badge in Jefferson City. She had loved him in the uncomplicated way of a woman who did not yet know what she was loving. When she found out, the disillusionment was total, and it had colored everything that came after, including her first impression of Deputy Chester Whitfield. She had seen him on her 3rd day in Ridgeline, riding down the main street on a big roan horse, and her first thought had been that he sat in the saddle like a man who was comfortable with authority in the way that some men were comfortable with cruelty. She had been wrong about that, she knew now, but the impression had stuck long enough that when he had spoken to her kindly at the mercantile, she had answered him with a coolness that she suspected had hurt him more than she intended. He was 31 years old. She had learned through the inevitable social osmosis of small-town life. Born in Virginia, come west after the war, worked cattle for 6 years in Texas before taking the deputy position in Ridgeline 2 years ago. He was liked, genuinely and not merely politically, which in a frontier town was the most reliable measure of a man's character. Sheriff Holt trusted him. The miners respected him. The women of the town found him handsome, which he was, in a quiet, serious-eyed way that did not announce itself. She had noticed. She had noted that she noticed, and she had put the information in a locked drawer in her mind and done her best not to think about it. Now, walking the dirt road toward town with the wind pulling at her shawl and the letters' words repeating in her head like a hymn she could not stop hearing, she thought about the locked drawer and understood that it was no longer locked. The main street of Ridgeline was busy in the late morning with wagons and horses, and the ordinary commerce of a mining town. Harriet walked past the mercantile and the land office and the bakery, nodding to the people she knew, ignoring the way that at least 3 women watched her with an expression that was almost guilty. She noticed that too. She filed it away. The sheriff's office was a low adobe building at the north end of the street, with a hitching post out front and a window with iron bars that were more symbolic than structural. She pushed the door open without knocking. Sheriff Gideon Holt was sitting behind his desk with a cup of coffee and a stack of wanted circulars, and he looked up when she entered with the easy calm of a man who had learned not to be surprised by anything that walked through his door. He was 53, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, with a face weathered by 30 years of outdoor work. He had been kind to Harriet since her arrival in a fatherly, undemanding way that she appreciated. He was also alone. Chester Whitfield was not there. "Mrs. Donnelly," Holt said with a genuine smile, "what brings you in this morning?" "I am looking for Deputy Whitfield," she said, and something in her voice made Holt set his coffee cup down very carefully. "He is out on patrol," Holt said. "Should be back around noon." Harriet looked at him steadily. She watched the way his jaw shifted almost imperceptibly, and she recognized it as the expression of a man who was choosing what not to say. "Sheriff Holt," she said, "how long has the deputy's patrol route taken him an hour out of his way to pass my property?" There was a silence that stretched long enough for Harriet to count the slow tick of the clock on the wall behind the sheriff's head. "Harriet," Holt said, and the shift from her formal name to her given one was answer enough. "He told you," she said. "He did not have to tell me," Holt said carefully. "I am the one who approved the patrol routes. And you let him. I did not stop him. Why did nobody tell me?" Holt looked at her with an expression that was complicated in a way she had not expected. Not guilt exactly, but something more careful, a deliberate choosing of sides that had already been made. "Because it was not anyone's place to tell you," he said. "Chester is a private man. He has his reasons for what he does, and he has his reasons for keeping them to himself. I figured when he was ready, he would speak." 8 months, Sheriff. I know it. That is not a man who is getting ready to speak. That is a man who has decided that riding past a woman's house in silence is preferable to the risk of her saying no. Holt looked at her for a long moment. "That is one way to read it," he said. "But I would invite you to consider whether the man riding an hour out of his way in the dark of December and January and February might also be a man who is afraid, Harriet, not of you, of himself, of what he wants and does not know how to deserve." She stared at him. She had not expected wisdom from this conversation. She had expected something she could be cleanly angry at. She left the office and stood on the porch in the cold air and waited for the clock in her chest to slow down. She did not have to wait for noon. 20 minutes after she left the sheriff's office, she was standing at the counter of the bakery buying bread she did not need when she heard the sound of a horse on the street outside and looked through the wavy glass of the window and saw Chester Whitfield ride past on his roan horse. He was not looking toward the bakery. He was looking forward, his hat low against the wind, his coat collar up, his whole body carrying the particular stillness of a man who was trying very hard to look like he was not thinking about something specific. She paid for her bread and walked outside. "Deputy Whitfield," she said. He turned, and she saw it happen, the thing she had not known to look for before, the way his face moved through 3 different expressions in the space of a single second. The first was surprise. The second was something that she could only describe as relief, the involuntary, unguarded relief of a man who has been waiting to see someone and cannot help showing it. The third was the careful, controlled mask that settled over everything else like a shutter closing. "Mrs. Donnelly," he said, and swung down from his horse with an ease that had nothing to do with showing off and everything to do with a man who had been doing this long enough that the gesture was simply part of him. He was 6 feet tall, lean rather than heavy, with dark hair that the wind was currently doing its best to dishevel, and gray eyes that were watching her with an attention she could feel. "I would like to speak with you," she said. "Of course," he said. She did not say it on the street. She told him to ride out to her property that afternoon, which she recognized was not the most strategic choice she had ever made, inviting a man she was not sure how to feel about to her own cabin, but she wanted the conversation to happen somewhere that was hers, somewhere she had control of the ground. He arrived at 4 o'clock, which was exactly when she had asked him to arrive, and she noticed that too, the precision of it, because Gerald Pratt had always been late in a way that was not accidental. She met him at the door and did not invite him inside. She stepped out onto the porch and pulled the door half shut behind her, and they stood in the fading afternoon light with the aspens chattering in the wind and the smell of wood smoke coming from her chimney. "I received a letter this morning," she said without preamble. Something moved behind his eyes. He said nothing. "From me Sutler," she said. "She thought I should know that you have been riding an extra hour out of your way every day for the past 8 months in order to pass my property." He did not deny it. She had half expected him to. Instead, he looked at her with those steady gray eyes, and his jaw was set in a way that she recognized as the particular resolution of a man who has decided to accept consequences. "That is true," he said. "Why?" He breathed in slowly. "Because I wanted to see that the lamp was lit," he said. "Because every morning when I came around that ridge and saw the light in your window, I knew you were all right and I could go on about the rest of my day." The words hit her somewhere she had not thought to defend. "Chester," she said, and she had not used his given name before, and she watched that register on his face. "You cannot make decisions about a woman's well-being without telling her you are doing it." "I know that," he said. "That is not being protective, that is being secretive, and I have had enough of men who keep things from me while wearing a badge." She had not meant to say that last part. It came out before she could edit it, and she watched his expression shift, not to defensiveness, but to something attentive and careful. "I hear that," he said. "And I am not going to tell you that my intentions make it not secretive. You are right. You deserve to know." She looked at him. The wind moved between them. "Then why did you not tell me?" He looked down at his hat, which he was holding in his hands, and turned it once around the brim in a slow revolution. "Because I was afraid," he said, quietly and without any performance of humility, just the plain statement of it. "Not of the rejection, I could manage that, but of doing to you what it sounds like someone has already done, making you feel like you were being managed without your knowing." The accuracy of that landed on her like a physical weight. "And yet here we are," she said. "Here we are," he agreed. She looked out toward the tree line, where the last of the light was catching in the aspens. She thought about Gerald Pratt, and she thought about the months she had spent being afraid of wanting something she could not trust, and then she thought about a man riding through February sleet, for the sole reason that the sight of her lamp burning in the dark made it possible for him to continue his day. Those were 2 very different kinds of men. She was not certain she was ready to name the difference yet, but she was honest enough with herself to admit that she could see it. "I am not interested in being watched over without my knowledge," she said, turning back to him. but I might be interested in getting to know the man who was doing the watching." The thing that happened to his face then was not what she expected. It was not triumph or satisfaction. It was something much quieter and more serious, the expression of a man who understands that he has been given something careful and intends to treat it carefully. "I would like that," he said. "Then come for supper on Friday," she said. "7 o'clock, and if you are so much as 5 minutes late, I will assume you have found something better to do." "I will not be late," he said. He was not. In the weeks that followed, Harriet discovered things about Chester Whitfield that the filtered gossip of small-town life had not prepared her for. She had expected him to be straightforward and capable, and perhaps a little dull, the way that quiet, competent men sometimes were when you removed the mystery from them. She found instead a man who had read more widely than almost anyone she had ever met, who had opinions about Frederick Douglass, and about the ongoing debates over Colorado water rights, and about the moral complexities of the cattle industry that were neither simple nor borrowed from anyone else's thinking. He had been educated in Richmond before the war, and then re-educated, as he put it with a very dry humor, by approximately 15 years of learning what the world was actually made of. He was also funny in a way that was so understated it took her a moment to catch it, which was exactly the kind of humor she had always responded to most, the kind that rewarded attention. The first Friday supper became a habit, and then an expectation, and then the organizing event of her week in a way that she acknowledged privately and fiercely, and with a deep appreciation for her own irony. She who had ridden to Colorado to be free of exactly this kind of entanglement was now planning menus on Tuesdays. She also saw him at work, which was important to her. She needed to understand who he was when he was not trying to make a good impression, and a man in a position of authority over others was never more fully himself than when he thought only his duties were watching. She saw him mediate a dispute between a miner named Horvath and a shopkeeper over a debt that had curdled into something personal and ugly, and she watched Chester listen to both men with an attention that was not merely procedural but genuinely engaged, and then offer a resolution that was fair in a way that left neither man feeling humiliated. She saw him help an elderly Ute woman whose horse had gone lame at the edge of town, arranging transport for her goods, and treating her with the same practical respect he would have extended to anyone, which in 1882 in a Colorado mining town was not nothing. She saw him once deal with a drunk miner who was being aggressive in the street, and she saw the efficiency and restraint with which he handled it, using the minimum necessary force, and then, when the man had sobered, going back to ensure he was all right and had someone to account for him. There was no cruelty in it. There was no performance of power. There was just a man doing a difficult job in a way that cost him something, and that he did not ask anyone to notice. She did notice. She filed it all away, and she sat with it in the evenings by her fire, adding it to the picture she was building of who he was, and the picture kept coming out clear. It was not until the third Friday supper that anything significant shifted between them. They had been talking about her father, who had taught school in Independence, Missouri, for 22 years, and who had believed with his whole being that education was the most democratic act a society could perform. Chester had listened with the quality of attention that was his particular gift, asking questions that showed he was actually thinking about what she said rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. And at some point she had said something about the way grief changes shape over time but never quite loses its weight, and he had been quiet for a moment, and then he had said, very quietly, "My brother died at Gettysburg." She had heard nothing about a brother. In 14 months in Ridgeline, she had heard almost nothing about Chester's life before he arrived there, because he was, as the sheriff had noted, a private man. "I am sorry," she said, and meant it in the way you can only mean it when you have lost someone yourself. "He was 22, Chester said. "His name was William. He was better than me in most respects, smarter, quicker to laugh." He stopped and looked at the fire for a moment. When I came west, it was partly because every town in Virginia had a piece of the war still visible in it. I needed to be somewhere that the loss was not built into the landscape. Did it work? She asked. Partially, he said. It is further away. It is not gone. She looked at him and understood something that she had not quite articulated to herself before. This man was not wearing a badge because it gave him power. He was wearing it because it gave him purpose, because it gave him a way to be useful in a world where he had seen what happened when men with weapons and convictions and not enough wisdom were pointed at each other. He was trying to be the kind of authority that protected rather than harmed, and the distinction mattered deeply to him. "Can I tell you something?" she said. "Please," he said. "The man I was engaged to in Missouri," she said. He was a deputy sheriff. She told him about Gerald Pratt then, not all of it, but enough. She told him about the early kindness that had turned out to be a kind of campaign, and the way the facade had cracked slowly and then all at once, and the particular horror of realizing that a man who had the legal authority of a badge and the social authority of being her betrothed had used both to make her feel small and afraid and trapped. She did not tell Chester about the worst of it, about the night Gerald had grabbed her arm hard enough to leave marks that lasted a week, because she was not ready to hand that to anyone yet. But she told him enough that he understood the shape of it. He listened without interrupting and without the kind of righteous anger that would have been, she knew, about him rather than about her. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "I understand now why I frightened you," he said. "And I understand why what I did with the patrol route was something you had every right to be angry about. I am sorry for that, Harriet. Not just because you asked for an explanation, because it was wrong." She looked at him steadily. "Most men would defend themselves," she said. "I am not defending what I did," he said. "I am asking you to let me do better." She was quiet for a long moment, listening to the fire and the wind outside. Then she said, "All right." It was after that conversation that the distance between them began, slowly and without announcement, to close. November came in with a hard cold and the first serious snowfall, and the world around Harriet's cabin became white and quiet and demanding in the way of mountain winters. She had spent the previous winter managing alone, which she had done with a competence she was proud of, but which had also been, she could admit now, significantly lonelier than she had allowed herself to acknowledge at the time. Chester's Friday suppers continued, and to them were added Thursday morning rides when his patrol brought him past her property at a time that they had, with a complete absence of drama and a great deal of mutual satisfaction, begun to coordinate. He would rein in his horse at her fence, and she would come out to the gate with coffee, and they would stand in the cold for 20 minutes talking about nothing in particular and everything that mattered. And then he would ride on and she would go back inside, and the day would feel different than it would have otherwise. She was aware that the town was watching this development with the focused attention of a community that does not have enough entertainment. She found that she did not particularly mind. The shame that Gerald had planted in her, the sense that any attachment she formed would somehow be a reflection on her poor judgment, had been fading steadily since she arrived in Colorado, and it was fading faster now. What she did mind, occasionally, was the pressure that came from certain quarters. Miss Sutler, who had written the original letter, and who seemed to feel this gave her some proprietary interest in the outcome, made comments at the mercantile that were meant to be encouraging, but which had the effect of making Harriet feel like an exhibit. A couple of the other women in town, those who had been interested in Chester for themselves, watched her with expressions that ranged from resigned to faintly hostile. She treated all of this with the same equable remoteness she brought to weather. What she was not expecting was trouble from a direction she had not considered at all. His name was Roland Bassett, and he arrived in Ridgeline in the second week of November on a bay horse with a great deal of expensive leather, and the air of a man who was accustomed to having things arranged for him. He was 38, dark-suited, handsome in an overworked sort of way, and he introduced himself to the town generally as a land speculator with interests in the mineral rights of the area. Harriet had no particular opinion about Roland Bassett until the third day of his presence in Ridgeline, when he came to her door. He explained with an easy charm that she could see was well practiced, been making inquiries about properties in the area, and had been told that her parcel was among those that might be available. He wondered if she might be interested in discussing terms. Harriet told him, with considerable courtesy, that her property was not for sale and that she had made no such indication to anyone, which was entirely true. She also told him that she appreciated his time and wished him good luck in his other inquiries. She had learned, in the year since Gerald, the considerable power of being clear without being heated. Bassett smiled and tipped his hat and left, and Harriet stood at her door watching him go and felt the particular prickling at the back of her neck that she had come to recognize as her instincts being more alert than her reasoning mind. She told Chester about it on Thursday morning, standing at the gate with her coffee, and she watched his expression carefully as she did, because she wanted to see how he handled information that was, technically, in his professional domain. He did not react with protectiveness that was really about control. He did not immediately move to resolve the situation on her behalf without consulting her. He asked, instead, what she wanted. "I want to know if he is who he says he is," she said, because he did not feel like a man who takes no for an answer. "I can make inquiries," Chester said. "I have contacts in Denver who keep track of land transactions. If Bassett has a history in the territory, they would know it." "Please do," she said. "If anything happens in the meantime," he said, and then stopped himself. She looked at him. "Go ahead." "I was going to say something about riding past more frequently," he said. "But I want to ask you rather than simply do it." She felt the warmth of that more strongly than she expected. "I would appreciate it," she said. What Chester's inquiries turned up, 3 days later, was a pattern that made Harriet's neck prickle harder. Roland Bassett was a real speculator with real money, but he had a history in the southern part of the territory of acquiring properties under conditions that later proved to have involved a great deal of pressure applied in creative ways, from exaggerated legal threats to the strategic placement of certain rumors about a seller's mental state or financial stability. Nothing that had resulted in criminal charges, but enough to draw the attention of people who tracked such things. Chester brought her this information on a gray Wednesday morning, unannounced, which was unusual enough that she knew before he finished dismounting that whatever he had found was not trivial. He sat at her kitchen table and laid out what he knew, clearly and without editorializing, and then he waited. "What are my options?" she asked. "Legally, unless he does something actionable, not much," Chester said. "But there are things that make men like Bassett move on. Primarily, the certainty that the legal and community resources of a place are not going to cooperate with his methods, meaning the sheriff's office is paying attention, meaning exactly that." She looked at him. "And is this you doing your job or you doing something for me?" He held her gaze. "Both," he said. "I am not going to pretend otherwise." She appreciated that more than a clean professional answer would have been. She said, "All right, and in the meantime, you document everything, every visit, every conversation, every piece of correspondence, and you do not sign anything without having someone else read it first." She nodded. "I can do that." "I know you can," he said, and the quiet confidence in that, the simple acknowledgement of her own competence, did something to the last of the walls she had been maintaining. Bassett came twice more. The first time, with a new offer that was generous enough to confirm that he wanted this specific property, and not simply any available parcel, and the second time with a letter from a Denver law firm asserting a prior easement claim over the eastern portion of her land that was, as Chester confirmed after examining the territorial deed records with the land office, entirely fabricated. That was the actionable moment. Chester filed a formal complaint with the territorial court in Denver, which triggered an inquiry into Bassett's past transactions, which was apparently the thing that Bassett had most wanted to avoid, because he left Ridgeline on a Tuesday morning with the same studied elegance with which he had arrived, and did not return. Harriet stood at her window and watched the road for a long time after she heard the news, feeling something loosen in her chest that she had not quite admitted was tight. When Chester came by that afternoon, she did something she had not done before. When he came to the gate, she went out to meet him as usual, and then she said, "Will you come inside?" And she meant not just for warmth and coffee, but for the real shelter of her space, the interior of her life, the place she kept most protected. He came inside, and he was careful with her things, with the books stacked on the windowsill and the good china her mother had left her that was displayed on the shelf above the fireplace. Careful in the way that someone is careful when they understand that these objects represent more than themselves. They sat at her kitchen table with coffee and a silence that was comfortable in a way that silences between them had been getting comfortable for some time now, and at some point she said, "I want to thank you. You handled it," he said. "We handled it," she said. He looked at her over his coffee cup with those gray eyes that she had come to understand, a kind of depth that did not advertise itself. "Harriet," he said, and then stopped. "Chester," she said, deliberately mirroring his tone, which made something happen at the corner of his mouth. "I would like very much," he said, with the careful precision of a man who has thought about how to say something for a long time, "to continue being in your life. Not as someone who rides past your house in the dark, but as someone you actually know is there." She set her coffee cup down. She thought about all the reasons she had built her careful distance. She thought about what she had learned about this man over the past 3 months, the real knowledge of him that was built on observation and conversation, and the difficult test of watching how he behaved when things were hard. She thought about William Whitfield, 22 years old at Gettysburg, smarter and quicker to laugh than his brother. She thought about her father teaching school in Missouri and believing that honesty was democratic. "I know you are there," she said. "I have known for some time." He looked at her steadily, and the hope in his face was so undefended that it made her breath catch. "Then let me be there properly," he said. "You already are," she said. "I am just telling you now that I am not going to keep pretending I do not want you to be." The winter deepened around them, and with it, the connection between them deepened in the unhurried, certain way of something that had been building for a long time before it was named. Chester came for supper every Friday without exception, and they added Sunday afternoons when the weather permitted, walking the trail above her property where the trees opened up to a view of the valley that was, in Harriet's opinion, the clearest possible argument for the existence of something worth believing in. They talked about everything. She told him more about Gerald, eventually all of it, including the night with the bruises, and he listened with a stillness that was not detachment but the opposite, the stillness of someone who is holding something very carefully because it is very important. He told her more about his life before Ridgeline, about the years in Texas working cattle on the great ranches south of San Antonio, which had been hard and lonely, and had given him a specific kind of patience with himself and others. About the slow erosion of the bright certainty with which he had grown up in Richmond, the son of a tobacco merchant family that believed very sincerely in the order of things, and about the war's brutal tutorials in what that order actually cost. He told her about the moment in 1874 when he had stopped a man from being lynched outside a small Texas town, a black man named James Cooper, who had been accused of a theft that Chester had quickly determined he had not committed, and about the specific personal cost of that intervention, the threats and the harassment that had followed him out of that county and part of the way into the next one. "Why did you do it?" she asked. "Because it was wrong," he said. "The same reason I do most things." That is a simple answer for a complicated act. Most right acts are simple to identify, he said. They are merely not always simple to perform. She looked at him with something that she had stopped trying to name and simply allowed herself to feel. "You are a good man, Chester Whitfield," she said. The color that came into his face at that was entirely genuine and entirely worth producing. He did not say anything for a moment. Then, quietly, "You are the person whose opinion of me I most want to deserve." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. It was the first time she had touched him in a way that was not accidental, not the brief brush of hands passing a plate, or the incidental nearness of standing at the same fence in the cold. His hand turned under hers, and his fingers closed gently around hers, and they sat like that for a while, watching the fire, and it was the most intimate thing she had done with any man since before she knew what intimacy could cost. Christmas came to Ridgeline with a particular beauty, the snow deep and clean, the pines dark against it, the town lit in the evenings by the warm windows of houses full of people who had chosen this difficult, gorgeous, impossible place to make a life. Harriet had decorated her cabin modestly, with pine boughs from the stand behind the property and a few candles, and the German glass ornaments her mother had treasured, and that she had wrapped in wool and carried all the way from Missouri. Chester brought her a book on Christmas Eve, making the ride out through 6 inches of new snow to deliver it personally. It was a collection of John Muir's writings about the mountains of California, published that year, and the inscription he had written inside was simply, "For the woman who taught me that being near something is not the same as being honest about it, with great gratitude for the difference. C.W." She read the inscription 3 times and then looked up at him standing in her doorway with snow on his shoulders and his hat, and she said, "Come in out of the cold." "I should get back," he said. "The road will be worse after dark." She looked at him with all the honest directness she had been practicing and said, "I am not asking you to stay, Chester. I am asking you to stop standing in the cold when there is warmth here." He came inside. They sat by the fire with mugs of mulled cider, and she read passages from the Muir aloud, and he listened and occasionally responded with something that showed he had read the same writer through a different experience and arrived at a different but compatible understanding, and it was one of the finest evenings Harriet had spent in years. Before he left, standing again in the doorway with his coat on and his hat in his hand, he looked at her for a moment with an expression that was asking something without words. She knew what it was. She had been feeling the same question building in herself for several weeks. She answered it by stepping forward and rising on her toes and kissing him, briefly and deliberately, and with all the intention she had, for the past 3 months, been carefully not expressing. When she stepped back, his expression was something she would remember for the rest of her life, the particular combination of surprise and recognition, and an emotion so large it had not yet settled into a name. "Merry Christmas, Chester," she said. "Merry Christmas, Harriet," he said, and his voice was rougher than usual in a way that she found she liked very much. January and February brought the depths of the mountain winter, and with it, a kind of intimacy born of necessity and proximity that was different from and deeper than the formal courtship they had been conducting. Chester helped her when her water pump froze solid on a night that dropped to 20 below, riding out at midnight when she had sent the neighbor boy with a message, and spending 2 hours in the brutal cold repairing it without complaint, and with a practical efficiency that she found intensely moving in a way she could not entirely explain. She brought him meals when he was working late during a particularly difficult period in January, when 3 miners from a claim north of town were found to have been defrauded by their partnering company in a scheme that required Chester and Sheriff Holt to gather and document an enormous amount of evidence before the territorial marshal could be called in. She did not do it to be seen. She did it because she understood what it was to do difficult work in hard conditions and to need someone to make it slightly less hard. The case resolved well, largely because of Chester's meticulous documentation, and when it was over he told her that the look on the 3 miners' faces when they understood that justice was actually going to be served was the reason he wore the badge. He said it without drama or self-congratulation, as a simple statement of motivating truth, and she loved him for it. She realized that was the word she was using, internally, carefully, not yet aloud. She turned it over in the privacy of her own mind and examined it from all angles, the way she examined anything that mattered, and she found that it was accurate. She loved Chester Whitfield. She loved him in a way that was different from anything she had previously called by that name, because it was built on knowledge rather than hope, and on the full sight of a real person rather than the reflection of her own desires. She loved his gray eyes and his dry humor, and the way he listened, and the way he had apologized without defense, and the way he had asked what she wanted before he acted, and the way he had sat at her kitchen table in December and held her hand like something precious. She told him on the last Sunday of February, which was a cold, bright day with the sky a hard, brilliant blue above the snowfields. They were standing at the viewpoint above her property, the valley spread below them like a painting, the aspens bare and silver against the white ground. She said, "I love you, Chester." Simply, without preliminary, in the direct way she had learned was the only way she could live honestly. He turned to look at her, and she could see that he was very still in the way he got when something had hit him that he had not prepared for, even though she thought he probably should have been preparing for this particular thing. "I have been in love with you since March," he said, "when I was riding past your property one morning and saw you standing at your fence in the first light, and you were reading a letter, and the way you were holding it told me that whatever it said was difficult, and I rode away wishing more than anything that you would let me be the person you could tell difficult things to." She stared at him. "March," she said. "That was before you started adding the hour to your patrol." "I had been riding past before that," he said. "I just had not been honest with myself about why." She laughed then, unexpectedly, a real laugh that the cold air carried out over the valley. "Chester Whitfield," she said, "you are the most roundabout direct man I have ever met." He took her hands in his and looked at her with all of it visible, all the feeling he had been careful with for the better part of a year. "I love you, Harriet Donnelly," he said. "I would very much like to go on loving you if you will allow it for the rest of my life." She looked at the valley and the mountains and the sky, and she thought about everything she had left behind and everything she had built in this hard, beautiful place, and she looked back at him. "I will not merely allow it," she said. "I intend to do the same." Spring came to Ridgeline with the particular extravagance of the high country, the snowmelt sending the creek running fast and clear, the wildflowers appearing on the lower slopes in a rush of color, so vivid it felt like an argument. Harriet planted her garden in the warming soil, and Chester helped her on a Saturday afternoon in April, digging rows with a concentration that she found charming, because he approached manual agricultural labor with the same seriousness he brought to everything. They were easy with each other by now in a way that felt like something long established, which was its own wonder, because it had not been that long. And yet the depth of what they had built had the quality of something that had been growing for a very long time, which she supposed it had. Sheriff Holt watched the development of their relationship with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had made a correct prediction, and was too principled to say so, but not principled enough to entirely conceal it. Harriet liked him for that, and she told him one afternoon at the general store, where they happened to be standing at the same time buying very different things, that she appreciated what he had said to her in October about the nature of Chester's fear. "I was right about the fear," Holt said. "I was less certain about whether it would resolve itself." "It needed a push," Harriet said. "It needed me subtler," Holt said with a very dry expression. Harriet laughed. She had forgiven me subtler with a completeness that surprised her, because the intrusion had, in the end, set something in motion that would otherwise have taken considerably longer. She had even thanked her, in a letter, which had produced in me subtler a degree of flustered pleasure that was genuinely touching. In May, Chester asked her to marry him. He did it in the kitchen of her cabin, on a Thursday morning when he had come in from the morning patrol, and she had poured coffee and they were standing on either side of the table, in the way they often stood, comfortable and close, and he set his coffee cup down and looked at her with the directness he reserved for things that mattered and said, "I would like to marry you, Harriet. I would like to spend every day in your presence and build something with you that belongs to both of us. I am asking because I want you to want this too and not for any other reason. She had been expecting it, in the way that you expect a season to turn, with certainty but not with the specific knowledge of the morning it will happen. She had been thinking about her answer for some time. "Yes," she said. "Absolutely yes." He smiled, and it transformed his face in the way it always did. The smile that she suspected very few people had seen, because he did not produce it for general consumption. The real one that reached all the way to his eyes and made him look, for a moment, very young. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and kissed her with all the restraint of the past month set carefully aside. And she kissed him back with equal honesty. And outside the window the spring was doing everything it could to be as extravagantly joyful as possible, which she appreciated as a piece of atmospheric solidarity. They married in June of 1883, in the small church at the east end of Ridgeline's Main Street, on a day that was warm enough to leave the doors open and bright enough that the mountain light poured in through the windows and lay across the wooden floor in long golden bars. Sheriff Holt stood with Chester, and a woman named Clara Hempstead, who had become Harriet's closest friend in Ridgeline over the course of the winter, stood with Harriet, and the rest of the town appeared to have decided that attendance was mandatory, because the church was fuller than it had been at Christmas. The minister, a grave man named Reverend Aldous Perch, conducted the ceremony with a simple dignity that Harriet appreciated, and when he asked her if she took this man, she said yes with a clarity that carried to the back of the room and made at least 4 women in the pews produce handkerchiefs. Chester's vows, which he had written himself, were the most precise and honest things she had ever heard spoken in a church, and she was not going to repeat them in their entirety to anyone because they belonged to her. But she held them alongside the inscription in the Muir book and the memory of him saying, "I could go on about the rest of my day," and understood that she was keeping a library of Chester Whitfield's particular language of love, which operated not in grand gestures, but in the accumulated weight of specific, real, chosen things. They held the reception at the cabin, because it was theirs, because it was where everything meaningful between them had happened. And the party went on into the warm June evening with the mountains turning pink in the sunset light, and the fiddle player Clara had hired playing with an energy that eventually cleared enough space in the yard for people to dance. Chester danced with her under the open sky, competently but not showily, in the way he did most things, and she rested her forehead against his shoulder for a moment and felt the particular completeness of being exactly where you are meant to be and knowing it. "Nobody told you," he said, quietly, against her hair. She pulled back to look at him. "Nobody told me what?" "About the hour," he said. "I was always sorry that it came out the way it did." "I am not," she said. "If me Sutler had not sent that letter, I might have spent another year being too cautious to let any of this happen." "You would have gotten there," he said. "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe the secret would have stayed between you and Sheriff Holt and half the town forever, and I would have gone on thinking I had adequately defended myself against something I was already too far gone to be defended against." He looked at her with those gray eyes. "When were you too far gone?" She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything. "December," she said. "The inscription in the book." He was quiet for a moment. "I worked on that inscription for 4 days," he said. "I know," she said. "It showed." He shook his head slightly, which was his version of laughing helplessly, and she loved it. The summer of 1883 was the best of Harriet's life thus far, and she held that knowledge with the careful, grateful attention of someone who has learned that good things are not guaranteed and should be properly recognized when they arrive. She and Chester settled the question of the 2 properties with a practical efficiency that satisfied them both, deciding to make her cabin their home, with additions that Chester began planning with a focused energy that she found enormously endearing, because he approached the problem of where to put a second bedroom with the same methodical seriousness that he applied to investigating fraud. He brought her the plans on large sheets of brown paper with everything measured and labeled, and they stood over the kitchen table pointing at the drawings and arguing cheerfully about the placement of windows until they arrived at something they both liked. The addition was built by October, with help from 3 miners who had turned out to have considerable carpentry experience and who were glad of the work between seasons. And by the time the first snow fell, the cabin had transformed into something that felt genuinely capacious and permanent, with a second bedroom that was framed in the same pine as the rest of the structure and a porch that wrapped around the south side and caught the afternoon light. Chester had kept his deputy position, which he was good at and which mattered to him, and which she had no desire to ask him to leave behind. She understood now that his work was part of who he was, not the whole of it, but a significant and load-bearing element. She continued teaching herself things, reading the books that Chester had in considerable quantity and that arrived by post from Denver, and she began, in the autumn, to teach reading to the 3 youngest children of the Garza family, who lived 2 miles down the road and whose parents had come north from New Mexico with nothing but their labor and their 3 boys, and who had been in Ridgeline long enough to put down real roots. The teaching was something she had not anticipated doing and found she loved. She had her father's conviction about education, and it turned out, something of his natural ability to communicate ideas in ways that were accessible to children without being condescending. The 3 Garza boys, who were 8, 10, and 12, were quick and motivated and made her think about what it would be like to have children of her own. She thought about this more as the autumn deepened, with a specificity that she had not previously permitted herself, and she did not keep the thought from Chester, because she had committed herself to not keeping things from him. "I've been thinking about children," she said, one October evening matter-of-factly, because that was the only way she knew how to say things that mattered. He looked up from the book he was reading with the full attention that was always his first response to her. "Have you?" he said, which was an invitation and not a question. "I think I would like them," she said, "not immediately necessarily, but as a wanted thing. I wanted to know if you wanted it too." "I have wanted children for a long time," he said. "I had largely persuaded myself it was not going to be part of my life." "It is part of your life now," she said. "It is," he said, with a quiet joy that she felt as warmly as if he had said it with great noise. The winter of 1883 to 1884 was cold and long and deeply contented. They read together in the evenings and walked in the snow on the days when it was tolerable, and Chester came home from patrol to the warmth of the cabin in Harriet's company, and she knew that he came home to it the way a person comes home to the one place in the world where their whole self is welcome. She felt it too, that wholeness, the particular completeness of being with someone who knows you, not the curated version of yourself that you offer the world, but the real thing, with all its edges and histories and difficulties, and who finds that real thing not merely acceptable but actively precious. In February of 1884, she told him she was expecting. He sat down. He had been standing at the counter pouring coffee, and he simply sat down on the nearest chair and looked at her with an expression that moved through astonishment and landed somewhere that she could only describe as reverent. "Harriet," he said. "We are having a baby," she confirmed, because she could see he needed the repetition. "When?" "August, I think." He got up from the chair and came to her, and held her with a gentleness that was also one of his particular capacities, this man who could be physically powerful when circumstances required it, and who brought that same intentional precision to tenderness. She leaned into him and felt the strength of his arms and the solid warmth of him, and the slight tremor in his breathing that told her he was more moved than he was letting show. "Are you happy?" she asked. "I cannot find a word large enough," he said. The pregnancy moved through the spring and early summer with a reasonable degree of ease, complicated by some weeks of genuine morning sickness in March and April, and a persistent lower back ache as summer came on, but essentially straightforward. She continued teaching the Garza boys. She continued her conversations with Chester and her reading and her garden, which that summer was the most productive it had been, the soil finally fully amended, and the season long and warm. Dr. Winifred Oakes, the town's physician, was a remarkable woman who had come to Ridgeline 2 years ago with a medical degree from a women's college in Boston, that a significant portion of the town's male population had taken some time to accept as legitimate, and who had established her credibility through the simple means of being exceptionally good at her work. She attended Harriet's pregnancy with a calm competence that was enormously reassuring. Chester was with Harriet through the labor, which began on a hot afternoon in late July and continued through the night. He held her hand with a steady presence that was exactly what she needed, not trying to fix anything, not pacing with performative anxiety, simply there in the particular committed way that had been his most consistent quality from the beginning. Their son was born in the early hours of the morning of July 29th, 1884, with a full set of lungs that he demonstrated without hesitation, and the world shifted again into a new and larger configuration. They named him William James Whitfield, William for Chester's brother and James for Harriet's father. Chester wept when she told him they were using his brother's name, quietly and without any attempt to prevent it, which Harriet thought was one of the finest things she had ever seen. William was, from the beginning, his own determined and opinionated self. He had Harriet's dark hair and Chester's gray eyes, and he approached the world with a focused intensity that neither of his parents found surprising. He was loved with an attentiveness and joy that Harriet suspected she could not have fully accessed before she had learned the difference between love built on hope and love built on knowledge. Because you cannot love a child the way you love an idea, and she was grateful for everything she had lived through that had made it possible for her to love this specific, real, extraordinary small person in front of her. The years that followed were good years in the way that real, lived years are good, meaning full of both difficulty and joy in equal, and sometimes intertwined measure, but grounded in the permanent warmth of a life built on honest foundations. Chester's reputation in Ridgeline grew, both for the quality of his work and for the particular quality of his character. And in 1886, when Sheriff Holt retired on account of his knees, which had been protesting his life choices for several years, the town council offered Chester the position of sheriff. He told Harriet about the offer the evening he received it, sitting across the kitchen table from her in the familiar arrangement that had been the location of most of their important conversations, with William asleep in the back room and the autumn wind making the pines talk outside. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "I want to take it," he said, "but I want to know what you think." "I think you have been doing the job for 4 years," she said, "and that being called by the right name changes very little about the work." "It changes some things," he said. "More responsibility, more visibility. You will handle it the way you handle everything," she said, which is to say carefully, seriously, and not without humor. He looked at her across the table with the expression she loved best on him, the one that was not quite a smile and was more than a smile, the full presence of his affection and amusement combined into something that was entirely his own. "Then I will take it," he said. He accepted the sheriff's position in November of 1886 and wore the new badge with the same quiet lack of self-importance that he had always brought to the work. Harriet was proud of him in a way that she expressed privately and specifically, and not through the performance of pride, because that was how she expressed everything. Clara Hempstead, who had been Harriet's witness at the wedding and who had become genuinely essential to Harriet's life in Ridgeline, married a mining engineer named Thomas Beck in 1885, and the two families had become intertwined in the comfortable way of people who have chosen each other's company freely and found it consistently rewarding. Their children played together. Their husbands respected each other. Their friendship had the particular quality of ease that develops between two women who do not need to perform anything for each other. In 1887, William, who was 3 years old and conducting a highly personal investigation of the limits of parental patience, gained a sibling. Harriet's second pregnancy was, if anything, slightly easier than the first, and the baby arrived in May. A second boy they named Samuel, which was Chester's father's name. Samuel came into the world with an entirely different disposition than his brother, which Harriet found endlessly interesting. The way that two children from the same parents and the same house could arrive as such distinctly themselves. Samuel was warm and easy, where William was intense and focused, quick to laugh in the way that Chester had said his brother William had been, which gave the name a particular resonance. The Garza boys, who had learned to read and had gone on well beyond what Harriet had initially taught them, were teenagers by now, and the eldest, Miguel, had expressed an interest in law that delighted Harriet and that Chester encouraged with the offer of a kind of informal apprenticeship in the sheriff's office, talking through cases and procedures with him on the afternoons when things were slow. This was, Harriet thought, entirely characteristic of Chester. The man who had once ridden an extra hour in silence to be briefly near someone he could not bring himself to approach, who had learned the costly lesson of the distance between watching and speaking, had become in the years since someone who reached deliberately and specifically toward the people around him in ways that were practical and real. She told him this once, watching him walk Miguel through the process of interviewing a witness, standing at the window of the sheriff's office where she had come to bring lunch. When he came out to the porch and found her there, she said, "You are a good teacher." He looked at Miguel, visible through the window and deeply absorbed in the notes he was writing. "He is a good student," he said. "Chester," she said. He looked at her. "I have been thinking about something and I want to tell you." "All right," he said in the way he always said it, which was full of genuine readiness. "That morning in October of 1882, she said, when I read Miss Sutler's letter, I was furious. And then I was frightened, and then I was moved in a way I could not account for. And then I came and found you, which was not the most rational decision I have ever made, but it was the right one. And everything that happened after came from that." She paused. "I am glad the secret existed. I am glad it came out, and I am glad it came out exactly when it did." He was quiet for a moment, watching her in the way he had always watched her, with the full directness of his attention. "I would have told you," he said, "eventually." "I know," she said, "but Miss Sutler was faster." "I owe Miss Sutler a great deal," he said. "We both do," Harriet said. She looked at him standing in the October light, the sheriff's badge on his chest and the gray beginning at his temples and the laugh lines deepening at the corners of his eyes, and she felt the full weight of everything they had built, which was considerable, and the full lightness of loving him, which had never been a burden in the way she had once feared love must always be. "I love you," she said. It was not the first time she had said it, and it would not be the last, but she said it now with the particular freshness of saying something that is old and true, and that has not lost any of its accuracy. He stepped toward her and took her face in his hands and kissed her in the full October sunlight on the porch of the sheriff's office, which was not technically appropriate to the dignity of his office, but which she was confident he had weighed and decided was worth it. "I love you," he said, "in ways I did not have the language for before you." She laughed and leaned her forehead against his shoulder, the gesture that had been hers since the night they danced at their wedding, which felt right regardless of the setting or the circumstances, or how many people might be watching from the street. The years continued, as years do, carrying things with them and taking other things away, and through all of it the central fact of what had been built between Harriet and Chester Whitfield remained constant and warm and more than sufficient. William grew into a serious, bookish boy with a passion for geology that he had apparently developed on his own, and that Chester supported with the same earnest engagement he brought to everything his children cared about. Samuel was a social, energetic child who made friends with the same ease his father had always found difficult, and who moved through the world with a warmth that made everyone around him slightly better. Harriet continued teaching, and as the years passed, the informal lessons to the Garza boys had grown into something more organized, a small, unofficial school that met 3 mornings a week in the back room of the church, and that served a rotating collection of children who, for one reason or another, could not attend the formal school on the other side of town. It was not a grand institution. It was just a room and some chairs and books, and a woman who believed, in the way her father had believed, that every person who learned to read had been given something that could not be taken away. Chester supported this without qualification and attended its occasional public presentations with a visible pride that Harriet occasionally had to ask him to moderate, because he had a tendency to look at her when she was doing something he admired with an expression so transparently fond that it became a distraction. "You are doing it again," she murmured to him at a reading she had organized in the spring of 1889, where 6 of her students read aloud from their chosen books to a small gathered audience. "Doing what?" he said with complete innocence. "Looking at me like that. I always look at you like that. In public it is rather excessive." "I respectfully disagree," he said, and she had to press her lips together very firmly to keep from laughing. In 1890, Ridgeline changed. The railroad came through, not the main line, but a spur from the larger route through Denver, and with it came the sudden acceleration of growth that transformed the quiet mining town into something louder and more complicated. New businesses opened. New people arrived with new demands and new problems. The sheriff's office expanded, with 2 new deputies hired to manage the increased population. Chester navigated this transformation with the same considered attention he brought to everything, adjusting the department's practices as the town's needs changed, without losing the essential principles that had always governed his approach to the work. There were more difficult days in this period than there had been before, more genuine lawlessness, more people trying to exploit the disruption that comes with rapid growth. And Chester came home on some evenings with a tiredness that was not just physical. On those evenings, Harriet made sure there was food and fire and quiet, and she let him decompress at his own pace without asking him to be present before he was able to. And when he was ready to talk, she listened, and when he was not, they sat together in a silence that was companionable in the way of 2 people who are so accustomed to each other's company that the absence of conversation is not absence, but simply a different kind of presence. He always said at some point in the evening that he was glad to be home. She was glad he was home. The children grew, the garden flourished, the school expanded. Ridgeline became, if not the grand city that some of its more ambitious inhabitants hoped it would be, a genuinely established community with an identity that had calcified around something real, the particular stubbornness of people who had come to a difficult place and decided to stay. In the autumn of 1891, Chester was re-elected sheriff by a margin that Sheriff Holt, visiting from his retirement in a smaller town up the valley and drinking coffee at Harriet's kitchen table, with the comfortable frequency of a man who has decided he is part of the family, described as historically unprecedented in Ridgeline's political life. "You are embarrassing him," Harriet told Holt. "He deserves to be embarrassed," Holt said. "The man works too hard to be properly vain about his successes. Someone has to do it for him." Chester, sitting across the table, looked at Harriet with an expression that was asking for rescue and receiving from her only a look of profound amusement. "You are on your own," she told him. "This is what comes of marrying a woman who does not coddle," he said. "It is one of my finest qualities," she said. William turned 7 that year and Samuel turned 4, and the 2 of them had developed a relationship of such comprehensive sibling complexity that Harriet sometimes stood in the doorway watching them, and marveled at the miniature civilization that 2 people who share a set of parents and a bedroom will construct between themselves, with its own rules and hierarchies and languages that have no translation for the outside world. She loved watching Chester with them. The patience he had for their questions, which were endless and frequently brilliant and occasionally deeply inconvenient, was of the same quality as his patience with everything, the kind that is not performance but actual, constituted capability. He read to them every evening that he was home at bedtime, from the collection of books that had grown to cover an entire wall of the new edition, and she could hear his voice through the wall of her bedroom, steady and expressive, doing the different voices for different characters with a complete lack of self-consciousness that she found very moving. There was a night in the winter of 1891 when she stood outside the boys' bedroom door for a full 5 minutes, not going in, just listening to Chester read. He was reading them a story about exploration, ships and ice and great distances, and he was reading it with a gravity and excitement that made it clear he was not merely performing the story for his children, but was himself genuinely caught up in it. She listened to the boy's occasional questions and his careful answers, and she thought about everything that had led to this particular moment, all the distances and decisions and hesitations and letters and conversations. And she understood that everything she had ever been through had been moving her, however painfully and indirectly, in the direction of this door and this voice and this life. She went in and sat on the edge of William's bed, and Chester looked up from the book with an expression of surprised pleasure, because she did not usually join the evening reading, and he said, "There is always room," which was entirely true, and she settled in beside him and listened to the rest of the story with her shoulder against his and her son's warm weight on either side of them. And outside, the December wind was doing what December winds in Colorado do, which is to remind you, with considerable force and volume, exactly how fortunate you are to be inside. In 1892, Harriet discovered she was expecting again. She was 38, which was not young for childbirth in 1892, and Dr. Oakes was thoughtful and thorough in her monitoring of the pregnancy, which was somewhat harder than the previous two, and required more rest in the final months. Chester managed this with a consideration that was, if possible, even more careful than his usual care, taking on more of the household work without being asked, and arranging the deputy's schedule so that he was home most evenings without making any particular announcement about the reason. She noticed all of it. She always noticed all of it. Their daughter was born in June of 1892, a warm and uncomplicated summer evening, and she arrived with a set of opinions about her circumstances that she expressed vigorously, and that Harriet recognized, with great amusement and no small amount of pride, as entirely her own contribution to the child's character. They named her Alina, Chester's mother's name, which pleased him more than he could easily say, and which Harriet had chosen deliberately because she knew that. He cried again, very quietly, when she told him the name, and she loved him for the honesty of it. Alina was from the beginning small and fierce and comprehensively herself, with William's intensity and Samuel's warmth somehow combined into a new and entirely individual configuration, and the older boys adored her with a fierce protectiveness that Harriet found both touching and occasionally amusing. With Alina's arrival, the cabin-turned house on the ridge above Ridgeline became a full and noisy and deeply inhabited place, and Harriet sometimes stood at the kitchen window in the early morning before anyone else was awake and looked at the mountains and the sky, and thought that this specific collection of people and years and small daily rituals was the thing she had come west to find, even though she had not known what she was looking for when she left Missouri. She had been looking for freedom. She had found something larger than freedom. She had found a life that was genuinely, specifically hers, built with her own hands and her own choices, and the love of a man who had once ridden an extra hour through the cold, day after day, simply to see that her lamp was burning. The lamp was burning. It had been burning a long time, and it would go on burning. Chester found her at the window one of those early mornings, coming downstairs while the house was still quiet, and he stood behind her and put his arms around her, and they watched the sun come up over the mountains together, painting the snowfields on the peaks pink and then gold, and then the brilliant, impossible white of full morning. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Everything," she said, "and nothing, the good kind of nothing." He kissed the top of her head. "Good," he said. She turned in his arms and looked at him in the morning light, at the face that she knew as well as her own now, the gray eyes and the silver at his temples and the particular quality of stillness that was his most distinctive characteristic, the stillness of a man who has found the place where he is meant to be and is not planning to leave it. "You know what I have never asked you," she said. "What?" "Whether you ever regretted it, the hour, all those months of riding past in silence." He considered the question with the seriousness she had come to expect from him, which meant he was not going to give her a quick, comfortable answer but the true one. "I regret the silence," he said. "I regret that it took me so long to find the courage to actually speak. I should have said something sooner. But the riding itself—" "No," he said. "Never. Those mornings were mine before anything else was possible. They were all I had of you, and I knew it, and I did not waste them." She looked at him for a long moment. "I am glad you kept riding," she said, "even in the dark of it, even when you did not think it was going anywhere." "I always hoped," he said. "I just could not ask you to match the hope until you were ready." "I am very ready now," she said. "I know," he said. "You have been very thorough about it." She laughed and leaned into him, and the morning light came through the kitchen window and lay across the floor in long, warm bars. And upstairs, a small, fierce girl was beginning to make the sounds that meant she would shortly be requiring attention. And down the hall, 2 boys were sleeping with the deep abandon of children who are completely secure. And outside, the mountains stood in their permanent, patient beauty. Harriet Donnelly Whitfield held her husband and her life, and the irreplaceable, specific, entirely real happiness of it. And she was grateful for every single mile of the long way around it had taken to get there, because everything she had been through had made her capable of knowing exactly what she had. Some years later, when William was old enough to be curious about the family stories that had begun to take on the quality of legend in the way that family stories do, he asked her how she and his father had gotten together. She told him about Miss Sutler's letter and the patrol route, and the morning she had gone to find Chester at the sheriff's office, and the conversation on the porch, and the Friday supper, and all of it, the way she remembered it, which was clearly and honestly, and without editing out the difficult parts. William listened with the focused attention that was so entirely his father's that it made her chest tighten in the good way. "He rode all that way every morning just to see your light in the window," William said. "Every morning," Harriet said, "and he never told you. Not until I asked." Her son considered this for a long moment with 12-year-old's gravity. "That was not a very efficient method," he said. "No," she agreed. "But it worked," he said. "It did," she said. "In its own time and its own way it worked very well." Chester, coming in from the yard at that moment, raised an eyebrow at the 2 of them sitting at the kitchen table. "What are you discussing with such concentration?" he asked. "Your courtship strategy," Harriet said. "Ah," said Chester, and sat down, and there was a look on his face that was equal parts dignity and sheepishness, and she loved him for it as she loved him for everything, completely and in full knowledge of what she was loving. "Your father wants to say it was very deliberate," she told William. "It was entirely deliberate," Chester said with great composure. "It was entirely terrified," Harriet said. "Both things can be true," Chester said. William looked between his parents with the expression of a child who is watching something he does not fully understand but recognizes as important. "Were you scared?" he asked his father. Chester looked at Harriet for a moment, then he looked at his son. "Yes," he said simply. "But I kept riding anyway. That is what you do with fear. You ride through it, and you let what matters matter more." Harriet looked at her husband and her son and the kitchen that had been hers and then theirs and that now held 3 children and 20 years of mornings, and she thought that nobody had told her once upon a time that the deputy had ridden an extra hour each day just to pass her cabin, but she had found out, and she had ridden toward it herself, and everything, absolutely everything, had come from that. The lamp burned, the mountain stood, the life held, and it was good.